The first hard frost came 3 weeks early that year, sliding down from the north like a silent creditor come to collect. It arrived in the dark before dawn, silvering the prairie grass and stiffening the half-muddy wagon ruts into iron. The Dakota wind carried it low and steady, not yet a scream, but a promise. By sunup, water buckets wore thin skins of ice, and breath hung in the air long enough to study. Most of the settlers took it as a warning and nothing more. Autumn had been generous long amber evenings, steady hunting, timber dry enough to split clean. Cabins stood where open land had been in spring. Rough pine walls chinked with clay and moss. Stone hearths set firm against one wall. Cast iron stoves hauled in by ox team from a railhead 2 territories away. Smoke rising in calm blue threads above each roofline. They believed in fire. When the cold threatened, you fed it wood. When it deepened, you fed it more. If the stove glowed red and your eyebrows singed when you leaned too close, that meant you were winning. Elias Morgan was not stacking extra cords. He stood outside his cabin at dawn, hands tucked beneath his suspenders, staring at the thin plume curling from his stovepipe. The wind pressed it low, flattening the smoke against the sky before tearing it apart. His beard was tipped white with frost, his boots stiff at the seams. Behind him, the cabin looked no different from any other, 12 by 14 feet, pitched roof, single door, one window facing south. But inside, he had begun to notice something that bothered him more than the cold. He had noticed how the wall behind the stove darkened first. The cabin had been raised in June with help from neighbors who swung axes in friendly competition. They had joked as they worked, measuring pride in the straightness of their logs and the tightness of their corners. Elias had kept his place modest, saying little, letting the others claim speed as virtue. By late summer, his roof was tarred, his chimney set, his stove installed, a second-hand cast iron belly stove with ornate scrollwork half-worn smooth. When autumn evenings cooled, he lit the first fire and felt the familiar comfort of flame. But within minutes, something strange happened. The back wall behind the stove grew hot to the touch, not warm hot. The sap inside the pine bled in sticky beads that glistened in the flicker. The chinking dried and cracked near the stovepipe collar. Meanwhile, the center of the room remained uneven. Stand near the stove and you roasted. Take 3 steps back and the air bit at your knuckles. He fed the fire more wood. That was the answer everyone trusted. But as October thinned and the nights stretched longer, he began to sit awake after midnight, listening to the stove tick and settle. He would rise from his narrow cot, pad across the plank floor, and place his palm against that wall again. It radiated heat outward like a body with fever. Heat was going somewhere. He did not have the language of engineers or the diagrams of city men, but he had spent years working around freight depots before coming west, watching how light flashed from polished metal and how the sun bounced from tin roofs bright enough to hurt the eyes. He had noticed how a cooking pan held over flame burned on one side and reflected on the other. He had watched winter sun glance off railcar sides and warmed the air beside them more than the wooden sheds nearby. Heat moved in lines, he suspected. It did not just soak and sit. It traveled. One afternoon in early November, when the sky was a hard enamel blue and the wind lay low, Elias hitched his mule and rode toward the abandoned rail spur 6 miles east. The line had been meant to extend farther into the territory but stopped short when funding dried. Crates and scrap had been left behind in a fenced yard, slowly surrendering to weeds. He dismounted and stepped through a gap in the leaning fence. Snow had not yet fallen, but frost glazed the metal bits strewn across the dirt, bent hinges, rusted brackets, a cracked signal lantern. He sifted through the debris with a boot, gloved fingers brushing cold surfaces. Then he found it. A wide sheet of metal, nearly 4 feet across and 3 feet high, once part of a crate lining. One side dulled with grime, the other surprisingly smooth beneath the dust. Not thick enough to serve as armor, not decorative, just a plane. He dragged it free, the edge screeching against stone. The mule flicked its ears at the sound. Elias leaned the sheet against a stump and wiped it with a scrap of burlap. Beneath the dirt, a faint sheen emerged, not mirror bright but capable of catching light. He angled it toward the afternoon sun. The light struck and bounced clear, direct, undeniable. He felt something settle into place inside him. The ride home was slow. The metal sheet rattled in the wagon bed, drawing looks from 2 men mending fence near the road. One called out, "Building a roof for your stove?" The other laughed. Elias tipped his hat and kept moving. By evening, he had the sheet propped against his cabin wall behind the stove. It looked ridiculous. Too large, too industrial for the small timber room. When he stepped back, the iron stove sat squat and black before it, like a preacher in front of a polished coffin. He waited until full dark to light the fire. The first flames rose and flickered orange against the iron belly. The stove warmed gradually, ticking as metal expanded. The sheet behind it caught the light and threw it back in wavering flashes. For a time, nothing seemed different. Then he placed his hand on the wall beyond the metal. Cool. He frowned and moved the sheet closer to the stove, leaving only an inch of air between. He adjusted it so the widest span sat directly behind the hottest part of the iron. The cabin filled with the smell of pine smoke and warming metal. Within an hour, he felt something new. The heat in the room seemed to push outward instead of bleeding backward. The space near the bed did not feel as sharp. The air along the floor moved gently, circulating instead of settling. He slept lightly, half expecting something to go wrong, a scorch mark, a crack, a strange noise. But when he woke before dawn, the back wall was merely warm, not blazing. The room felt steadier. It was not yet winter. The true test had not arrived. The next day, neighbors came by on routine errands, borrowing a draw knife, trading dried venison for flour. Each one noticed the sheet. "What is that for?" asked Tom Keegan, leaning sideways to inspect it. "Trying something," Elias said. Tom snorted. "Trying to make it uglier." Laughter followed. Elias did not argue. He did not explain. He only said, "Wall was getting too hot." "That's what walls do." Another replied. "Means your stove is working." That night, frost crept heavier along the windows. The wind rose and rattled the eaves. Elias built a moderate fire, not the roaring blaze he would normally use to chase early cold. He watched the metal glow faintly in reflected orange, watched how the light bent and shimmered. He extended his hands toward the room instead of the stove. The warmth met him. Days passed. The cold strengthened in slow, deliberate steps. The prairie lost its autumn gold and turned brittle gray. Each morning required breaking ice from the bucket. Each evening demanded longer burning. In other cabins, fires were fed constantly. Men woke every 2 hours to push in new logs. Sparks climbed chimneys and snapped against the dark. Wood piles shrank at alarming rates. Elias kept careful track of his own. Before the sheet, he had burned 6 logs through a long cold night. After, he found himself using 4. The stove did not seem to cool as quickly. The warmth lingered in the room air instead of vanishing. He began to understand the invisible path heat had been taking. Without the sheet, the stove radiated in all directions. The wall behind it drank deeply and passed that warmth outward into the freezing air beyond. The energy that should have comforted him had been warming the wilderness instead. The metal interrupted that path. It did not absorb, it returned. Late in November, a heavier wind came, a preview of what January might deliver. It howled from the north, flattening grass and driving dust against cabin walls like thrown sand. Smoke from chimneys blew horizontal before dissolving. Inside, stoves glowed fierce. That evening Elias invited no one. He built his fire and sat in a straight-back chair at the center of the room. He watched the sheet catch flame light and cast it forward. He noticed that he could sit farther from the stove and still feel the same heat as before. He rose once more and touched the wall behind the metal, barely warm. He smiled, though no one saw it. Outside, the prairie wind roared like distant surf. Inside, the room held steady. In the days that followed, word spread not because Elias boasted, but because people noticed he was not cutting as much wood. While others hauled fresh loads from the tree line, he mended harness straps and patched his roof. Someone asked how much he had burned that week. He gave the number plainly. They did the arithmetic themselves. Still, laughter lingered. "Metal one stopped January," Tom said one afternoon. "Wait till the real cold." Elias nodded. "I am." The first snow fell in early December, thin and wind-blown. It dusted the prairie and vanished by noon. The second came heavier, laying white across roofs and fence posts. The third stayed. Cabins became islands in a frozen sea. Elias rose one morning before sunrise and stepped outside. The sky was iron gray. The air bit through wool and skin alike. His breath clouded thick and slow. From neighboring chimneys, smoke rose in frantic bursts. He could hear axes striking wood in urgent rhythm. He returned inside and fed his stove. The metal sheet gleamed dully behind it, catching firelight as always. He ran a hand along its edge, feeling the faint vibration of heat moving across its surface. "Let's see," he murmured to the empty room. The cold would deepen. It always did. And when it did, men would respond the only way they knew: more flame, more fuel, more labor. Elias had chosen a different fight. He had chosen to turn the fire around. By mid-December, the cold stopped pretending to be a visitor and settled in like an owner. The prairie no longer shifted between thaw and frost, it hardened. Snow lay in wind-carved ridges along fence lines, and the sky carried that pale. metallic brightness that meant the air would not rise above comfort for weeks. Smoke from chimneys did not drift upward in lazy columns anymore. It shot straight out, flattened by the wind, then shredded into nothing. Inside the cabins, stoves roared. Men who had once prided themselves on careful wood now fed their fires like gamblers chasing loss. Split logs thudded into iron mouths every hour. Sparks spat upward in showers when doors were opened too fast. The air near the ceiling shimmered from heat, while the floor stayed cold enough to stiffen bare toes in seconds. The back walls behind the stoves grew hot, dangerously hot. Resin seeped from knots in the pine, forming glossy tears that hardened into amber beads. The clay chinking near stovepipes cracked from repeated expansion and contraction. In more than one cabin, snow melted in a perfect oval patch on the roof directly above the stove. Its position, revealing the outline of heat escaping into open air. And still, the rooms were uneven. Stand 3 feet from the stove and your face flushed. Move toward the bed and your breath clouded. Sit at the table near the far wall and your fingers stiffened around your tin cup. It was a problem no one named because no one had words for it. They only responded the way they always had: more wood. Elias Morgan watched quietly. He had not removed the metal sheet. If anything, he had adjusted it with greater care. He had mounted it properly now, fastening it with small iron brackets, so it stood firm an inch behind the stove, not touching the wood at all. That inch of air mattered. He had discovered that the gap allowed heat to move and circulate rather than trap itself. When his stove burned, the metal did not absorb and darken like timber. It gleamed. It threw back waves of warmth that could be felt in the center of the room. One afternoon, with wind scouring the plains and snow hissing across the ground like thrown sand, Tom Keegan stepped inside Elias' cabin without knocking, stamping his boots hard against the threshold. "Blowing straight from the Arctic," Tom muttered, rubbing his hands. "Feels like knives." He stopped when he saw the stove. The fire inside burned steadily but not wildly. No furious red glow, no roaring draft. Tom squinted at the metal sheet. "Still got that thing up?" Elias nodded. "Still does what I hoped." Tom crossed the room cautiously, as if expecting to find some trick. He stood near the stove, bracing for the usual blast of scorching heat. Instead, he felt something different. Warmth met him, yes, but not the sharp, blistering blast he expected. It was broader, fuller, as if the air itself held it rather than the iron alone. He glanced toward the back wall. "Does that burn it worse?" Elias reached behind the stove carefully and placed his palm against the wall beyond the metal. "Try it," he said. Tom hesitated, then leaned carefully and extended his hand past the sheet. His brow furrowed. It's not hot. Warmer than the rest of the wall, Elias said, but not cooking. Tom stepped back, looking at the sheet as if it had shifted shape. Outside, wind hammered against the cabin and rattled the window shutter. The stove door ticked softly as fresh wood caught. "What is it supposed to do?" Tom asked. Elias considered how to answer without sounding foolish. "Fire sends heat out in every direction," he said slowly. "Forward, sideways, backward. Wood drinks what hits it. Then the cold outside pulls it through." Tom scratched at his beard. So I'd rather the heat come back into the room." Tom laughed once, uncertain. "Heat dawned to turn around." Elias looked at the faint glow dancing across the metal surface. "Light does." Tom opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He stayed a while longer, long enough to notice something else. The far side of the room near the cot did not feel like a separate climate. The air was not biting there. It was comfortable. "How much wood you burning?" Tom asked casually. 4 logs most nights," Elias replied. Tom snorted. "Impossible." Counted. Tom left unconvinced, but thoughtful. Over the next week the cold deepened further. Temperatures fell below 0 and stayed there. Water froze solid in buckets, left indoors if set too close to the door. Ink thickened in bottles. Even the dogs moved slower, curling tight against barn walls. In other cabins, the back wall behind the stove grew so hot that some man nailed extra boards over it as a crude barrier, believing thickness alone would solve the problem. It did not. The new boards absorbed heat too. Some placed stones between stove and wall, thinking mass would help. The stones warmed? Yes, but they still allowed heat to flow into the wood beyond. Elias observed quietly. He began to test small things. One evening he polished the metal sheet further, rubbing it with sand and oil until it shone brighter. The next night he noticed a subtle difference. The room seemed to warm faster. The reflection appeared stronger, more direct. Another evening he shifted the sheet, as angled by a fraction, tilting its top slightly forward. The warmth seemed to push outward more deliberately into the center of the cabin. He was learning without books, guided only by attention. The true revelation came on a night when the wind dropped entirely. Still air in winter could be more dangerous than wind. Without movement, the cold pressed in from all sides, silent and suffocating. The temperature plunged deeper than it had yet that season. In Thomas' cabin, 6 logs burned by midnight. In Harper S., sparks shot high enough to threaten the flue. Men woke repeatedly to feed their fires, cursing under breath as they swung cold legs from warm blankets. Elias fed his stove before lying down and let it settle into a steady burn. He watched how the metal behind it shimmered faintly, throwing warmth forward, even after the flames dipped lower. He lay on his cot, eyes open to the dim orange glow, and felt the air remain consistent, not scorching, not frigid. Consistent. He woke once in the night expecting cold. Instead, he felt warmth still held in the room as center. The stove had not died, but neither had it needed constant feeding. The reflected heat seemed to linger, spreading rather than vanishing. In the morning, frost edged the inside of the window glass, but only near the corners. The center pane remained clear. He rose and checked the wall behind the stove again. Warm, not searing. He smiled faintly. The problem no one saw was not the cold alone. It was waste. Heat that soaked into timber and escaped through chinks. Heat that rose straight upward and vanished through roof planks. Heat that warmed the wilderness while men inside shivered. He began to see it everywhere now. Visiting Harper. As cabin one afternoon, he noticed the back wall glowing almost dark from repeated scorching. The air near the stove burned his cheeks, but 2 steps back he felt the draft from the door's seam. The stove worked furiously, yet the comfort radius remained small. "Fees like I am heating the trees," Harper muttered while adding another log. Elias did not comment. He only watched the flame pattern and imagined invisible lines of energy shooting backward into wood. When he returned home, he stood before his own stove and studied it as if it were machinery. The iron belly radiated in all directions equally. The metal sheet behind it interrupted half that spread and sent it forward. It was not creating heat. It was redirecting it. That distinction mattered. He was not burning hotter. He was wasting less. As December neared its end, talk in the settlement shifted from harvest memories to survival arithmetic. How many cords left? How many weeks until thaw? Whose roof leaked melted snow from excessive chimney heat? Whose children coughed from smoke drawn too hard through drafty seams? Elias listened and measured his own supply. He had cut less wood in autumn than most. Now he understood he would not need more. One evening, with snow falling thick and slow, old man Harper visited again. He entered without mocking this time, only curiosity in his eyes. "Tom says you are burning half what he is." "Not half." Elias corrected gently, "just enough." Harper stepped closer to the stove, extending hands cautiously. He felt the warmth, then glanced toward the metal. "Explain it plain," he said. Elias hesitated, searching for words that did not sound like fancy theory. "Stand by a pond in summer," he began. "Sun hits the water. You see it flash back at you?" Harper nodded. "Same sun hits dirt. It just soaks in. Dusty flash. Go on." "Fire is no different. Wood soaks. Metal flashes." Harper studied the sheet again, his weathered face thoughtful. "So you were turning the fire around?" "Yes." Harper crouched slightly and touched the floorboards midway across the room. "Fee's warmer here than mine does," he admitted. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the stove's low hum. Outside, snow continued falling, covering tracks and leveling the prairie into a blank white page. Harper finally stood. "Might try it," he said gruffly. Elias nodded once. After Harper left, Elias remained by the stove long into the evening, watching flame and reflection play across iron and metal. He no longer felt foolish for dragging scrap across miles of frozen ground. He felt observant. The problem had never been the fire. It had been direction. Winter would grow harsher still. January loomed with stories of 30 below and winds that froze breath midair. But Elias no longer felt he was fighting blindly. He had seen the invisible path heat traveled and learned how to bend it. Outside, the prairie lay silent and merciless. Inside, warmth moved forward. The cold that settled over the prairie in the second week of January did not feel like weather. It felt like judgment, the kind that arrived without argument and offered no appeal. By the time the sun rose on the morning, the settlers would later remember, as the coldest of that winter, the land had gone utterly still, as if even the wind had frozen in place. The sky was a bleached, merciless blue. The snow did not sparkle. It glared. Elias Morgan woke before dawn not because he was cold, but because the silence had weight. He lay on his cot for a moment, listening. No wind clawing at the eaves, no loose shutter tapping, just the faint, steady ticking of cooling iron from the stove. He swung his legs over the side of the cot and stood barefoot on the plank floor. It was cold, but not punishing. That alone told him something. He crossed the room slowly and crouched before the stove. The embers from the night before still glowed deep red beneath a layer of ash. He cracked the draft slightly and fed in 2 small split logs, arranging them carefully so they would catch without smothering the coals. Behind the stove, the metal sheet waited in dull gray silence. He struck a match and held it low. The kindling caught. Flames licked upward, tentative at first, then steadier. The iron belly began its slow expansion, ticking softly like distant clockwork. Elias stood and reached for the thermometer hanging near the center beam. It read higher than he expected for a fire that had burned low through the night. He frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition. The warmth had lingered. He walked to the small window and wiped away a crescent of frost with his thumb. The glass bit his skin instantly. Outside, the world was white and unmoving. No smoke drifted yet from neighboring chimneys. The air was too still. He opened the door just enough to reach the thermometer nailed to the outer frame. The cold hit him like a physical wall. It stole his breath in a single inhale. The inside of his nose burned. The tiny hairs in his beard stiffened with ice almost instantly. He glanced at the reading. 32 below. He closed the door immediately and leaned against it for a moment, allowing the warmth inside to reclaim him. 32 below. This was the test. He turned slowly and looked at the stove. Flames had grown stronger now, rolling across the wood with steady hunger. The iron radiated outward, and behind it the metal sheet began to shimmer faintly, catching light and heat and bending them forward. He moved to the center of the room and stood there. The warmth met him not fiercely, not with the aggressive blast he remembered from early season fires, but steadily, broadly. He extended his hands. The heat did not feel concentrated at a single point. It felt distributed. He stepped back farther, toward the cot near the far wall. He stood there for a full minute, measuring sensation. Still warm. Not hot, but livable. He returned to the stove and carefully slid his hand past the edge of the metal sheet to touch the wooden wall behind it. Warm. But nowhere near the blistering heat he had felt in October before the sheet had been installed. He kept his palm there longer, testing. The wood did not threaten to burn him. The realization settled deeper now, not as hope, but as confirmation. The fire was no larger than on any other cold morning, but the room felt larger. By mid-morning, the stillness outside broke. A distant crack echoed across the prairie as trees along the creek line split under pressure. The sound carried unnaturally far in the dense cold air. Smoke began rising from neighboring cabins thick, heavy plumes that climbed straight upward before dissolving. Elias stepped outside briefly to fetch more split wood from the small stack near his wall. The air was brutal, invasive. Each breath felt like swallowing ground glass. He moved quickly, boots crunching sharply against snow hardened into crust. Across the yard, he saw Tom Keegan emerge from his cabin, axe in hand. Tom's chimney belched thick smoke. Even from a distance, Elias could see the faint red glow through the cabin. A small window where the stove burned hard. Tom paused mid-swing and looked toward Elias. They held each other, gazed for a moment. Tom lifted the axe in acknowledgement. Elias nodded once and returned inside. By noon, the sun hung pale and useless in the sky. It gave light but no warmth. The outside thermometer had dropped further, 34 below. Inside Elias's cabin, the central thermometer held steady at a number that would have seemed impossible to him just weeks earlier in such conditions. He did not overfeed the stove. He added wood only when the flame began to dip too low. Each time he opened the stove door, he noticed how the heat seemed to pulse outward from the iron and strike the metal sheet behind it, then roll forward into the room. It was visible in the faint shimmer of air. He crouched and watched closely. Heat rose from the stove, struck the metal, and curved outward. At the same time, cooler air from the floor moved toward the stove, warmed, and joined the upward flow. The circulation was subtle but persistent. The cabin no longer felt divided into zones of fire and frost. It felt unified. In Tom's cabin, the situation was different. By early afternoon, Tom had fed nearly twice the wood he normally would on a severe cold day. The stove glowed nearly red at its sides. The back wall behind it had darkened further from repeated scorching. Yet when he stepped to the far side of his cabin near the bed, he could see his breath. He stood there, staring at the thin cloud forming before his mouth. He cursed under his breath and returned to the stove, throwing in another log. The heat near the iron became almost unbearable, but it did not travel. It climbed upward, struck the ceiling, and vanished through small seams and nail holes no one had bothered to seal. By mid-afternoon, frustration outweighed pride. Tom wrapped a scarf around his face and crossed the short distance to Elias's cabin. The cold bit hard, but the path was short. He knocked sharply and stepped inside before waiting for a reply. The difference struck him instantly, not warmth like a summer day but consistency. He removed his gloves slowly, flexing fingers stiff from cold. "You burning hard?" he asked. "No harder than usual," Elias replied calmly. Tom moved toward the stove and crouched, bracing for the familiar blast. The heat met him, but it did not scorch. He turned slightly, angling his body toward the center of the room. It was warm there, too. He stood and walked deliberately toward the far wall near the cot. He paused. No visible breath. He exhaled slowly, testing. Nothing. He turned back toward Elias. "It's warm," he said, "but it's not cooking." "No," Elias replied. Tom stepped back and folded his arms. "In mine," he said slowly, "I can stand close without feeling like I'll blister. But I can sit at my table without freezing." Elias nodded. "Heat. Running backward in yours," he said. Tom frowned. "Backward?" "Into the wall. Into the roof. Outside." Tom looked around the room again, this time not at the stove, but at the space itself. The air felt steady. "How much wood since dawn?" Tom asked. Elias gestured toward the remaining stack. 4 logs. Tom's eyes widened slightly. "I've burned near 8. They stood in silence for a long moment, listening to the steady crackle of flame. Outside, the cold pressed harder, as if testing every weakness in timber and seam. Inside, the warmth held. Tom finally spoke. "It ain't bigger fire," he said quietly. "No," Elias agreed. "It is pointed different." "Yes." Tom stared at the metal sheet once more. "You turned it around." Elias allowed himself a faint smile. "Something like that." As dusk approached, the temperature dropped further still. 36 below. The cold outside reached a point where exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Across the settlement, fires burned furiously. Wood piles shrank visibly. Men paced, unable to sleep, feeding stoves constantly. In Elias's cabin, he fed the stove one more measured load and adjusted the draft. The fire settled into a deep, steady burn. He sat in his chair at the center of the room and watched the metal sheet catch and return the glow. He felt no panic. When he lay down that night, the wind had returned slightly, moaning low across the prairie. The cabin creaked in protest, but the air inside remained consistent. He woke once near midnight out of habit. The room was still warm, not blazing, not dying, holding. He rose quietly and checked the thermometer. The number had dropped only slightly. He added 2 small logs, not out of desperation, but maintenance, and returned to bed. Outside, the blue norther reached its deepest bite. Inside, the warmth did not flee. By morning, the cold had begun its slow retreat. The thermometer outside read 30 below instead of 36. It felt almost merciful by comparison. Elias stood at the center of his cabin and turned slowly, taking in the walls, the stove, the metal sheet behind it. The test had come. The cold had pressed as hard as it knew how, and the fire had not needed to grow larger. It had simply needed direction. The morning after the worst of the blue norther broke, the settlement did not wake all at once. It stirred cautiously, as if unsure whether the cold had truly loosened its grip or was merely pausing to gather strength again. Smoke rose thinner from chimneys now, less frantic. Doors opened a crack before being pulled shut again. Men stepped outside briefly, tested the air, then moved with deliberate economy. The prairie lay stripped and silent, snow flattened into hard waves by days of wind. Fences leaned under white weight. The creek remained locked in ice. Sound traveled strangely far. The chop of an axe carried half a mile without distortion. Elias Morgan stepped out with a small bucket to fetch packed snow for melting. The cold still bit hard, 28 below by his reading, but it no longer felt like a blade pressed to the throat. It felt survivable. Across the short stretch between cabins, he saw Harper standing beside his woodpile, staring at it with an expression somewhere between relief and irritation. The pile was noticeably smaller than it had been at the start of the week. Harper noticed Elias and gave a short nod. "You slept?" Harper called across the brittle air. "Most of the night," Elias replied. Harper grunted. "I did tea." Elias did not answer. He returned inside with his bucket, set it near the stove, and fed the fire a measured pair of logs. The iron warmed gradually, ticking in familiar rhythm. Behind it, the metal sheet caught the growing glow and returned it into the room. He had come to appreciate that first half hour of morning burn. The way the chill receded not from proximity, but from space itself. The way the center of the room warmed first now, not just the air, immediately hugging the stove. By mid-morning, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find Harper standing there, hat pulled low, eyes narrowed, not from cold this time, but from concentration. "Mind if I step in?" Harper asked. "Of course." Harper entered and closed a door carefully behind him. He removed his gloves slowly, glancing around the room without speaking. The stove burned steady now, roaring, not dim. Harper approached it cautiously, as if expecting to be struck by hidden force. He extended his hands. Warmth met him. He shifted slightly, angling himself toward the center of the room. Still warm. He took 3 deliberate steps backward toward the cot and paused. No visible breath. He looked down at the floorboards, then up toward the ceiling. Even. He turned slowly toward the stove and the metal sheet behind it. That thing, he said quietly, nodding at the sheet. Elias waited. I tried stones, Harper continued. Stacked, M behind mine, figured they'd hold heat. And? They got hot. Walls still got hotter. Elias nodded once. Harper crouched and peered behind the metal sheet, studying the narrow gap between it and the wooden wall. You left space. Yes. Why? So air can move. Harper frowned slightly. Explain it plain, he said. Elias considered the request carefully. When the stove burns, he began. It throws heat in all directions. Forward into the room. Backward into the wall. Upward into the roof. Harper nodded. The wall drinks what it gets, Elias continued. Then the cold outside pulls it through. Harper reached out and pressed his palm to the metal sheet, as surface. He held it there, feeling the warmth. This dawn, to drink it, he said slowly. No, Elias replied. It turns it. Harper looked up sharply. Turns it? Like a mirror turns light. Harper stood slowly, absorbing the idea. He walked deliberately to the far wall near the cot and stood there for a long moment. Then he returned to the stove and crouched again, watching the flame pattern through the stove. Small glass pane. How much would you burn last night? He asked without looking up. 4 logs. Harper let out a low whistle. I burned near 9. Elias said nothing. Harper stood again and crossed his arms. You retelling me that scrap of metal is doing the work of 5 logs? No, Elias said calmly. It is keeping 5 logs, worth from leaving. The words hung in the air. Harper. His expression shifted not disbelief now, but calculation. Outside, another figure approached through the snow. Tom Keegan. He knocked once and entered without waiting. Harper? He said in mild surprise. Harper nodded toward the stove. Look at it, he said simply. Tom had already seen it the previous day, but this time he observed differently. He did not stand only near the stove. He moved through the room, testing air with deliberate slowness. He placed his hand on the back wall behind the metal sheet. He stepped to the far wall. He crouched near the floor. It's even, he muttered. Yes, Harper agreed. Tom straightened and looked at Elias. How thick is that thing? He asked. Thin, Elias replied. Does need to be thick. Tom frowned. Then why does it work? Elias gestured toward the stove. Fire gives off heat as waves. You can see them, but you can feel them. Wood absorbs those waves. Metal sends them back. Tom scratched his beard. So it is like bouncing? Yes. Harper's gaze sharpened. And the space behind it? Air warms there too, Elias said. Moves upward, keeps the wall from taking it all. Tom crouched again, studying the gap more carefully. You were not touching the wall with it. No, Tom stood slowly. Mine is nailed right up against the wood, he said. Elias raised an eyebrow. You put one up. Tom nodded once. Last night. Didn't he leave space? And? Walls still got hotter than I liked. Elias gestured gently toward the inch-wide gap. Give it room, he said. Tom absorbed that without argument. The 3 men stood in silence for a moment, listening to the stove's steady crackle. Outside, the settlement carried on with cautious optimism. The cold had eased slightly, though winter was far from finished. Harper turned toward the door. I am putting one in, he said flatly. Tom nodded. So am I. Neither laughed. Neither mocked. By afternoon, the sound of hammering echoed from multiple cabins. Scrap metal once discarded as useless found new purpose. Old shovel heads were flattened. Tin panels salvaged from broken crates were cut and mounted. Even a discarded iron wash basin was hammered into a flat sheet behind one stove. Elias worked quietly in his own cabin, adjusting nothing now. He had already done his experimenting. Instead, he listened as neighbors tested their own versions. By evening, Tom returned. Left space, he said simply. And? Tom's eyes held something like reluctant admiration. Fee's different already. Harper stopped by shortly after. "Wallace not cooking," he reported. Room steadier. Elias nodded. Over the next several days, temperatures remained brutally low, though not as extreme as the Blue Norther's peak. The true test came not in the coldest hour, but in the sustained days that followed. Cabins that had installed metal sheets with air gaps began to show subtle but undeniable differences. Wood consumption slowed. Back walls no longer darkened as severely. Snow patches on roofs above stoves shrank or vanished entirely. Men who once woke every 2 hours to feed their fires now found they could sleep longer between stokes. The laughter that had greeted Elias as scrap metal weeks earlier faded into something else: curiosity first, then respect. One evening, a small gathering formed in Elias's cabin without invitation. Not formal, not ceremonial, just neighbors drifting in after chores. They stood around the stove in quiet study. "It ain't tea magic," Tom said finally. "No," Elias agreed. "It is just not wasting." "Yes." Harper leaned closer to the metal sheet, watching how the firelight shimmered across its surface. "We've been heating the trees outside," he said quietly. Elias did not respond. The statement was answer enough. The lesson spread faster than any rumor. Within a week, nearly every cabin in the settlement had installed some form of reflector behind its stove, some polished carefully, others rough but effective. Men began experimenting further. One angled his slightly downward to push warmth lower into the room. Another extended his sheet wider to catch more of the stove as rear radiation. The discussions grew more thoughtful. How far from the wall? Does shinier work better? Should it reach above the stove's height? Elias answered when asked, but he did not claim ownership of the idea. "It asks the fire. Heat," he would say. "Just send it where you want it." The true change, however, was not only in temperature, it was in thinking. For the first time that winter, men began to consider not how to burn more, but how to waste less. The fires did not grow larger, they grew smarter. By late January, woodpiles across the settlement stood noticeably taller than they otherwise would have. Smoke from chimneys thinned slightly, not from weaker burns, but from steadier ones. Inside cabins, the back walls no longer glowed dangerously dark. The air felt more uniform, less divided. And in Elias's cabin, the metal sheet continued its quiet work, catching invisible waves and bending them forward. One evening, as snow fell softly outside and the wind lay still, Harper lingered after others had left. "You did say nothing when we laughed," he said quietly. Elias shrugged. "No use arguing with cold," he replied. Harper nodded slowly. "You doubled it," he said. Elias shook his head gently. "No," he said. "We just stopped throwing half of it away." Harper stood there for a moment longer, then placed his palm flat against the metal sheet. It was warm. Not burning, warm. He withdrew his hand and smiled faintly. Outside, winter still ruled the prairie, but inside, something had shifted. Not just heat. Understanding. By the time February settled over the prairie, the settlers no longer measured winter only in degrees. They measured it in wood. How many cords remained stacked beside the cabin? How many logs were left beneath the lean-to? How many days of burning stood between them and the first thaw? Wood was labor stored in advance. Every split log represented hours of chopping, hauling, stacking. Every armload burned through the night meant sweat spent months earlier beneath a warmer sun. When the blue norther had struck, men saw their winters shrinking in real-time, piles collapsing faster than expected, stacks thinning before mid-season. Now, something had changed. Not dramatically at first. Not in a way that would impress a city man with instruments and charts. But the difference showed in the quiet arithmetic each homesteader performed while standing beside his woodpile. Before the metal sheets, the numbers were predictable. 6 logs for a long cold night if the temperature dipped below 0. 7 if wind rose hard from the north. Sometimes 8 when panic set in and the stove was overfed in frustration. During the worst stretch of January, Tom Keegan had burned nearly 9 logs in a single night trying to hold back 30 below air. He had woken every 2 hours, half frozen at the edges of his blanket, cursing as he swung his legs from warmth into cold. He remembered the sting in his fingers as he lifted the stove door latch. The rush of fierce heat against his face, the roar when fresh wood caught. And then the slow return of chill at the far end of the cabin, while the back wall behind the stove grew hotter than a branding iron. It had felt like fighting water with a bucket that leaked from the bottom. After installing the metal sheet mounted an inch from the wall, just as Elias had suggested, the numbers began to shift. The first night he tried it, Tom burned 5 logs instead of 8. He had expected failure. He had kept 2 more logs ready at his bedside in case the cold broke through. It did not. The second night, he used 4.5. The third, only 4. The stove did not burn hotter. In fact, he noticed it burned steadier. The iron no longer glowed red at the back, where heat once concentrated. The back wall stayed warm, but no longer blistering. The far side of the room felt livable without standing directly before the stove like a worshipper, before an altar. He began counting carefully. 4 logs per night. Sometimes 3.5 if the wind was mild. Across the settlement, similar calculations unfolded. Harper, who had once stacked stones behind his stove to little effect, now ran his palm across a polished tin sheet mounted behind his iron belly stove. Before, 7 logs nightly in deep cold. After, 4. He had tested it deliberately one evening, refusing to feed the fire beyond 4 logs, despite instinct urging him to add more. He had walked the length of his cabin again and again, expecting the far wall to surrender to frost. It did not. He had slept longer that night than at any time since December. Woodpile mathematics was unforgiving and simple. If a man burned 7 logs a night for 60 nights, he consumed 420 logs. If he burned 4 logs instead, he consumed 240. A difference of 180 logs. 180 logs meant weeks of chopping saved. It meant less exposure to brutal wind. It meant time regained for repairing harness, mending boots, tending animals. It meant margin. The settlement began to feel that margin in small, quiet ways. The frantic chopping that once echoed daily through the frozen grove slowed. Smoke from chimneys grew less desperate, less furious. The air inside cabins steadied, no longer divided sharply between scorching stoveside and frigid corners. Elias Morgan observed these changes with quiet satisfaction but without triumph. He had not invented fire. He had not made winter gentler. He had simply refused to let heat vanish into wood and sky. One afternoon, as pale sunlight filtered weakly through frost-rimmed windows, Tom stood in Elias, his cabin holding 2 split logs. "Guess how many I burned last night," Tom said. Elias looked up from mending a harness strap. 4, he answered calmly. Tom grinned reluctantly. 4. He set the extra logs down beside the wall. "Used to be near 8 on a night like that," he continued. "Thought I'd defreeze if I did T-feed it." Elias nodded. "You weren't T-freezing," he said. "You were losing." Tom frowned slightly. "Losing? Half the heat," Elias replied. Tom glanced toward the metal sheet behind Elias' stove. It gleamed faintly in the firelight, steady and unremarkable now. It dawned, "Feel like it should make that much difference," Tom admitted. "It does to make more heat," Elias said. "It keeps the heat you already paid for." Tom considered that. Paid for. Each log represented time in the woods, axe biting through frozen grain, time hauling sleds through snow, time stacking and covering against early frost. To burn wood unnecessarily was not simply wasteful. It was foolish. Over the next week, the numbers continued to hold. 4 logs per night in sustained cold, 3 in moderate freeze. On one evening when wind dropped and temperature hovered near 10 below, Harper managed with only 3.5 logs and awoke still comfortable. The back walls behind their stoves no longer radiated fierce heat outward into winter. Snow patches on roofs above chimneys shrank noticeably. The timber around stovepipes ceased darkening further. And perhaps most telling, sleep improved. Before the reflectors, men woke frequently from uneven temperature shifts. The stove would roar early, then burn low, leaving the room's edges to stiffen first. The cold crept in silently from corners, forcing another stoking. Now the heat distributed more evenly. It lingered longer in the air. The room cooled gradually rather than sharply. Elias noticed it himself most clearly on nights when he deliberately let the stove burn lower than instinct advised. The warmth did not collapse suddenly. It faded slowly, predictably. He began keeping small tallies scratched into a wooden board beside his woodpile. Night 1, 4 logs. Night 2, 4 logs. Night 3, 21, more 2 logs. Night 4, 4 logs. The pattern held steady even as February winds returned with new force. One evening a fresh front swept across the prairie. Not as severe as January as Blue Norther, but sharp enough to drive temperatures below 20 below once more. In past winters, such a drop would have triggered anxiety. Extra logs stacked indoors. Fires overfed. Smoke thick and urgent. This time, Elias fed the stove as usual. 4 logs. He sat in his chair and watched the metal sheet catch the glow. The warmth filled the center of the room steadily. The far wall remained free of frost. He slept uninterrupted. The next morning, he checked his woodpile. It stood taller than expected for mid-February. He ran the numbers in his head. If winter stretched another month, he had enough. More than enough. Across the settlement, similar realizations dawned. Tom stood beside his pile one afternoon, hands on hips, counting silently. He laughed once under his breath. "I've got near a week, it's worth extra," he muttered. Harper did his own count and found similar surplus. The arithmetic was simple and undeniable. Before the metal sheet. 6-7 logs per night. Constant stoking. Back wall dangerously hot. Sleep broken. Woodpile shrinking fast. After the metal sheet. 3-4 logs per night. Longer steady heat. Safer walls. Fuller sleep. Woodpile holding. The change did not require bigger stoves, thicker walls, or more timber cut from dwindling groves. It required attention. One evening, several men gathered in Harper, cabin to compare observations. Each had mounted a reflector slightly differently, some wider, some taller, some polished brighter. They spoke not in boasts but in numbers. 4 logs last night. 3.5. 5 when wind picked up. But that, still less than before. They compared wall temperatures by touch. They examined soot patterns on stovepipes. They noticed less resin bleeding from knots. Elias listened more than he spoke. When someone finally turned to him and said, "You figured it first," he shook his head. "I just noticed where the heat was going," he replied. Woodpile mathematics became common conversation. Instead of arguing over whose stove burned hotter, men discussed draft settings and reflector spacing. Instead of competing over who cut the largest stack, they measured efficiency. The prairie remained harsh. Winter did not soften out of respect, but the settlement's relationship with it changed subtly. They were no longer trying to overpower cold with brute flame. They were redirecting it. By late February, daylight lengthened slightly. The sun lingered a few minutes longer above the horizon. Snow on south-facing slopes showed faint signs of settling. Woodpiles across the settlement stood visibly healthier than anyone had predicted in December. One afternoon, Tom leaned against his cabin wall and looked toward Elias's place. "You know what this means?" Tom called across the yard. "What is that?" Elias replied. "Less chopping next fall." Elias smiled faintly. "Or more time for better walls," he said. Tom laughed. The lesson extended beyond that winter. Men began considering other inefficiencies in their cabin scaps and chinking, draft leaks under doors, heat rising uselessly to rafters. They began asking not how to burn more, but how to lose less. The metal sheet behind the stove became ordinary, so ordinary that newcomers assumed it had always been there. But the arithmetic remained etched into memory. 180 logs saved over a season. 180 hours not spent in frozen woods. 180 fewer chances for frostbite or falling trees. In frontier life, survival was rarely about invention. It was about attention. Elias stood one evening beside his stove as the fire burned low and steady. The metal sheet behind it shimmered softly, returning warmth into the room. He placed his palm against it. Warm, not blazing, warm. He glanced toward the woodpile outside through the window, frosted edge. Still strong. Winter had not grown weaker. They had grown wiser. By early March, winter no longer felt endless. It still ruled the prairie, with cold mornings and brittle nights, but something subtle had shifted. The sun lingered a little longer each afternoon. Snow along the southern edges of cabins softened first, sinking into itself and shrinking from rooflines. Icicles formed, then dripped in slow, rhythmic taps that sounded almost foreign after months of silence. Inside the settlement, another quiet shift had taken root. No one laughed at the metal sheets anymore. In fact, it became difficult to find a cabin without one. What had started as a single polished scrap behind Elias Morgan. Stove had multiplied into variations across the prairie. Some reflectors were cut from salvaged tin roofing. Others were hammered flat from old iron pans. A few were carefully polished until they shone bright enough to cast a faint image of the stove back at itself. No two looked exactly the same, but they all did the same work. They turned the fire around. The transformation had not come with ceremony. There had been no meeting called, no proclamation made. Just a series of cold nights, hard numbers, and quiet observation. Tom Keegan's cabin now held a broad sheet of tin mounted an inch from the wall with small wooden spacers. Harper's featured a taller iron plate that extended slightly above the stove. Top angled forward just enough to push warmth deeper into the room. Even the Jensen family, who had initially dismissed the idea as unnecessary tinkering, installed a modest reflector, after noticing how slowly their woodpile diminished compared to neighbors. By the final weeks of winter, the settlement's smoke rose thinner and steadier. Woodpiles stood taller than expected, and sleep came easier. Elias did not speak much about it. He had never intended to change the habits of others. He had only wanted to solve a problem in his own cabin, the side of his back wall, growing hot, while the center of the room remained uneven. But now, as he sat one evening in early March, watching the fire, as glow rippled across the metal sheet behind his stove, He understood that the lesson had reached further than heat. It had reached thinking. The prairie wind returned one night with sharp edges. Not as brutal as January as Blue Norther, but strong enough to remind everyone that winter was not finished yet. Snow blew low and fast across the ground, whispering against cabin walls. Inside Elias's cabin, the stove burned low and steady. He fed it 3 logs, no more. The metal sheet shimmered softly in the firelight, bending warmth forward. The air moved gently, circulating rather than stratifying. The back wall remained safe, no longer a silent conduit for wasted heat. He rose and walked to the far side of the room near his cot. The warmth held, not intense, not fragile, held. He remembered the early days of autumn when neighbors had laughed at the sight of scrap metal bolted behind his stove. Planning to cook the wool? One had joked. He smiled faintly at the memory. There had been no anger in him then, only certainty. Heat traveled in lines, light reflected, metal turned what wood absorbed. The principles were simple. The application had only required attention. The following afternoon, Harper stopped by without knocking, as had become habit. "You notice something?" Harper asked, removing his gloves. "What is that?" Elias replied, "I've got wood left," Harper said, almost suspiciously. "More than I planned for." Elias nodded. "So do I." Harper glanced at the metal sheet behind the stove. "Never thought a thin piece of scrap would mean that much." "It's not the metal," Elias said quietly. Harper raised an eyebrow. "It's the direction." Harper considered that for a moment, then chuckled. "Still sounds like magic when you say it that way." Elias shook his head. "No magic in it. Fire's the same as always." That was the truth. The stoves had not grown larger. The flames had not burned hotter. The cabins had not been rebuilt. They had simply stopped heating the outdoors. As thaw approached slowly and the snowpack began its gradual retreat, evidence of the winter, as severity lingered. Few warped boards on cabins where walls had overheated before reflectors were installed. A cracked stovepipe in one house, where draft had been forced too aggressively. Wood piles in cabins that had delayed adopting the metal sheets stood noticeably shorter. The comparison was clear enough that no one argued anymore. One afternoon, Tom stood beside Elias outside, both men watching meltwater drip from the eaves in steady rhythm. "You think folks back east do this?" Tom asked. Elias shrugged. "Some might. Seems like something they write about." "Maybe," Elias replied. Tom nudged a chunk of melting snow with his boot. "Funny thing is," he said, "we were all trying to beat the cold by burning harder." Elias nodded. "And all we had to do was stop losing half of it." Tom laughed softly. "Reckon that as true for more than fire." The comment lingered in the air between them. As days lengthened further, the settlement shifted toward spring tasks. Fences were repaired, tools sharpened, seed sacks inspected. But the metal sheets remained mounted behind the stoves. No one removed them. They had become part of the cabin, as design, as natural as the chimney or the door latch. Children growing up in those homes would assume that was simply how stoves were installed, always with a reflective plate behind them. They would not remember a time when back walls scorched and wood vanished at twice the necessary rate. The change had embedded itself quietly into habit. Years later, when new families arrived and asked why every cabin had metal behind its stove, the explanation would be given plainly. It keeps the heat in. No grand story. No dramatic retelling of laughter and doubt. Just a fact. Elias sat one evening near the end of March as the fire burned low. Outside, the last crusts of snow clung stubbornly to shaded ground. The air no longer carried the knife edge of deep winter. He watched the flame flicker and dance against the iron belly of the stove. Behind it, the metal sheet reflected the glow forward one more time. He thought back to that first autumn morning when he had noticed the back wall growing too hot while the center of the room remained uneven. That quiet irritation had led to observation. Observation had led to experiment. Experiment had led to understanding, not invention. Understanding. He rose and placed his hand flat against the metal sheet. Warm. Not searing. Not wasted. Warm. Outside, winter loosened its grip at last. Inside, the lesson remained. Sometimes survival did not require larger fires. Sometimes it required asking a simple question. Why let the heat go where you dawn? Need it. And in that small question, answered with scrap metal and attention, the settlement had found something larger than warmth. They had found direction.